Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to What's a Woolpert. We, of course, have Ben Blumenscheid here, and I am Dan McKellick, your host. And today we are fortunate to have Kristi Barker here. Kristi, would you
Hey.
give us just a brief description of where you're at, what you do for Woolpert, etc., like an intro?
Sure. So my name's Kristi Barker. I'm a program director located in Virginia Beach, Virginia. I specialize in pursuits in the interior design market as well as the private market here in our region. About a year or so ago, I stepped into this role, which is more business development oriented. Prior to that, I was the interior design team lead, so I was more involved on the production side of our work. I think we're going to be talking about an interesting subject today, which actually doesn't directly involve any of our clients. And it's funny for me to have been to be talking about this particular subject because math is not my forte. In fact, I carry around a little meme that says, God knew I would be far too powerful if I could do math. So it's funny to be talking to you all today about the Fibonacci sequence and the golden ratio, but um, it's something that's covered in all architectural programs, architectural universities programs. And several years ago, I was a adjunct professor at the Art Institute here locally, and found myself in a class having to teach this subject, realizing that I had not really dived into it as I should have in college because it was math, and I just sort of like, I think I understand it, and moved on to the next thing, and really dived into it and was like, okay, wow, this is kind of cool. And
So then, to back up a second, then the theme of
yeah,
today's episode is the Fibonacci sequence. Am I saying it right?
the Fibonacci sequence and how that relates to what is actually used in architecture, which is the golden rectangle and the golden triangle.
Okay, and I know Ben was pretty geeked about this one from the get go. I
Yeah,
was
yeah.
like, I kind of have heard of this thing, and I've seen the graphic. I know what it looks like, but I have
Yeah,
no real appreciation for it. I don't mean it that way. I mean, I'm just like a layperson. I don't know about it,
right.
and so I did a little bit like we normally do. We do a little bit of looking and kind of do a little bit
Hmm.
of research. And I got to be honest, I wasn't entirely sure. Is the root here biology? Is it nature? Is it math? Because when you start looking around, they're like, oh, it's used for this, it's used for that. So like at its core, what is the Fibonacci? If I'm saying it correctly, I always feel like I'm saying it wrong.
Right.
Sequence.
So the gentleman who's referred to as Fibonacci, came up with the sequencing of the mathematics behind it, the patterning behind it in the early 1200s.
Okay.
But there were, people, building things way before that that were using these these ratios, these mathematical aspects, and it's interesting. It's in architecture, art, botany, biology, etc. So it's often called like God's fingerprint. It's very There's something spiritual about this particular sequence of numbers and how it's plotted, and you know,
So the ratio came before the sequence of numbers.
yes, there were. I think there were people that were just building things based on it without necessarily documenting that they had figured this thing out. So, like the Great Pyramids of Egypt were obviously far before the 1200s when this guy sat there and sort of mathematically figured this thing out, which apparently he figured out because he wanted to know how many pairs of rabbits he would have by the end of the year. If a certain pair of rabbits gave another pair of rabbits, which then gave another pair of rabbits, and what would that look like as a mathematical equation? The numbering sequence says I start with nothing, and then I add one,
Hmm.
and then I add 0 and 1, and I get 1, and then I add 1 and 1, I get 2. I add 1 and 2, I get 3. I add 2 and 3, I get 5, into infinity.
Yeah.
And
So it's
then
pretty
if you,
simple. It's just
yeah,
adding the
and
two consecutive numbers together till the
yeah,
end of
but
time.
yeah, you're always adding the two consecutive numbers
Hmm.
together. But then, somebody took it a little further, somebody far smarter than me, and said, oh, well, if I take the two consecutive numbers, well, for example, just say 3 and 5, and I divide 5 by 3, I get 1.6. If I do the next number, 8 and 5, and I divide 8 by 5, I get 1.6. If I divide 13 by 8, I get 1.6.
Okay.
And so that ratio is called phi. The Greeks called it phi. So the Greeks had figured this out before Fibonacci, that there was this ratio of the sides of a rectangle to the height. So that that golden rectangle is the ratio of the long side to the short side divided, and it's always, ideally in the golden ratio, it's always 1.6. So the best known example that people will see in architecture is the Parthenon in Athens, which when you do an overlay on it, it isn't just the overall size of the actual Parthenon, but it's all the breakdown of the columns in between. They all have golden rectangles between each of the columns, and then on the frieze are all golden rectangles, and then the even the detailing and the dental moldings are all golden rectangles. It's just covered with them. So there's just something inherently pleasing architecturally about that balance. There are some where it's not like that, and you're going, it doesn't look right. It just
It's
there's
a
something
weird
that seems a
combination,
little
though, to
off.
say it's a very predictable mathematical sequence, right? It's just
Mm-hmm.
adding the two consecutive numbers. But then someone basically said, hey, not only is this has a certain ratio to it, but this ratio in the sequence of numbers is what we deem as aesthetically pleasing. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? Like it's
Yeah.
kind of random, but kind of not, in that, aesthetics are subjective, but people, and I saw like diagrams for the human face, like your eyes versus the shape of your mouth, like
Mm-hmm.
all kinds of different things in which they're basically saying that this mathematical sequence would be used in design for aesthetics, right? I mean, so a lot of it is the fact that from what people can design and draw, they're basically saying that if you use these ratios in the sequence of numbers to like size things, I guess, or scale them,
Mm-hmm.
you'll get
Mm-hmm.
something that's aesthetically pleasing, which is kind of odd because math has nothing to do with aesthetics or subjectiveness. So I don't know. I mean,
Well, the math equation, it explains it. It's
Yeah.
there whether somebody put a mathematical equation to it or not. It's like an example of your hand or your ear. Your ear is the spiral that's inside of the golden rectangle.
So I've always been curious
It
about that. Like, is does it truly? So I've often seen the reference of like a nautilus
Mhm.
shell.
Mhm.
Um, does it truly show up? I mean,
Yes,
it does. How accurate is it?
it
I
does.
guess.
Sunflowers are another example, and the spiral on the interior of the sunflower as the seeds grow out. And if you want to sit there and get your, specular out and look at it, you would count them, and the number of spirals going this way versus the number of spirals that way will always be two of the opposing side by side numbers in the Fibonacci sequence, as will the number of petals on the outside.
and then there must be, because I saw some of that in nature where they said, I don't remember, and you can probably correct me, Kristi, but like daisies always have either five or the next whatever
8.
Fibonacci sequence of petals. So
Mhm.
are
Wow,
we
really?
basically
Yeah.
saying that it truly, I mean, there must be some exceptions because nature's wild. Like, what's the percentage of
Yeah, I
saying, if
mean,
I look at,
there's probably somebody out there whose ear isn't exactly that spiral, right?
but I mean, there was some
But
pretty wild
yeah.
scenarios where they said all of
Mhm.
the, I don't remember what it was, but it was a sunflower seed, the spirals you see in the head. It was
Yeah.
the amount of flower leaves that you see on lilies versus marigold. I don't remember making it up
Yeah,
versus
but they're
roses.
all a
Yeah, it was
number
that
in that
sequence though.
sequence.
Yeah.
Pine cones,
Hmm.
if you look at the base of them, where you can see the spiral of the seeds. Pine cones, or artichoke flowers,
Hmm.
uh, are some examples.
So
Trees, even though they're
maybe
not as easy to see, trees apparently, they sort of sprout in the same way. Fern fronds. So we've all seen the little curled up fern fronds that kind of,
Mhm.
the tails of seahorses. It's just, it's
Wow.
there's just, and so you start to say, okay, well, if you're a person of faith, you might say, yeah, there's really something here, in that. If you're more of an analytical type, you're saying, okay, well, what, like you said, Ben, why? Um, and there's something in there that just makes that the growth factor of that. There's an easy, non-impeding way for things to grow that way. That's just so many things take advantage of. So they want the maximum number of seeds in a sunflower or whatever. That's just the way that it grows. Um, But yeah, I mean, our lungs, our bronchial branches, all these things, um,
So
can
maybe
be
at its
broken
core,
broken
it's like
down
a
that way as well. They look like root systems of trees, which all grow in that same sort of pattern. Um,
seems like it's almost like at its core reproductive. You know what I mean? Because
yeah.
you're growing seeds, you're growing flower petals, you're growing a human body, even right. Um, Maybe at its
Mm-hmm.
core, it's just the nature of cellular mechanisms or something, such that as
Mm-hmm.
they grow, they follow this natural process, and that's why I assume, with some degree of confidence, you can say every daisy's got whatever it is, 8 flower petals. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It's wild.
Yeah.
I love though that the application of aesthetics when you and then you bring it into like art and architecture design, how we're just drawn to that
Mm-hmm.
naturally because it just looks like it belongs. Maybe.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So I did see where obviously there's the aesthetics of it, right? And we've all talked about that. And I think again, Ben, I'm sure you'll put it up there. We've all seen it before, just in popular culture, but probably most of us didn't take a deep dive on it. But when you look around, they talk about practical applications and population growth models, risk management. There was one that if you
Yeah.
Google Fibonacci sequence, the first hit is a sponsored ad that said something like Fibonacci in financial investing, which
Mm-hmm.
seemed like a little bit of snake oil. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But like,
Yeah.
what about beyond the aesthetics, or just maybe the idea that I understand proportions in my hand are going to be of this nature? Are there other sorts of practical applications? I mean, like I said, they had all kinds of things about mathematical models, risk
Mm-hmm.
management, and like I said, even some people that I think were a little far-reaching, saying they're applying this to financial investing. I mean, that immediately tells
Yeah.
me I'm not going to click that link. Sounds like a scam,
It's
but
funny.
that's
I
kind of
saw
wild.
something as I was prepping for this as well. I was like, okay, I'm very familiar with having explaining it in architecture and art, and even to some extent in, biological examples. But did see something on that end of things, and I thought there seems to be too many outside variables to control, like whether you could predict that. But then this person said, they had done years and years of research in the whatever stock market thing they were looking at, and it was like for every 3 times it went up, it came down five. For every 5 times it went up, it came down. And I was like, so I don't know if they were sort of forcing the pattern onto something, or whether there was really something there. And like I said, math is not my greatest subject, which just blows my mind that I'm talking about math today. But so yeah, if you start getting into the stock market and things, you're getting a little out of my out of my expertise, but there must be something there, right?
Hmm.
Um, in just human behavior that sort of is tracking along on that.
Are there similar principles that you see, whether from a math or a design perspective, like um, that are out there in addition to the Fibonacci sequence? I mean, are there other sorts of heuristics that people use in design, or I mean, you think about, like, I don't know, like other math sequences like pi or something that factor into things like this.
Well, there's so many things in historical architecture that tie back to this, that there really is an emphasis in education on this particular principle. But a more modern architect, Le Corbusier, took this a little bit further. He wrote a book called Le Modular, and basically said, I'm going to take a human figure with its arm up and one arm down, and overlay the golden rectangles and the golden triangles over this figure, and basically to prove that there was this always this modular that basically breaks it down to the human form. So there are even more modern architects that have looked at it and kind of delved into it a little bit further. um, and they come to the same thing. Your arm up is one, your body is then two, your legs are three. It's just like it's just um, it's all there. And then, modern art, a lot of people are familiar with the work of Mondrian, and all his work is based on
Hmm.
the squares and the rectangles and then just color blocking and how that works. So it's I don't recall that there being something quite so substantial. There's certainly other things where you can discuss how I, like Frank Gehry's work is completely doesn't follow. Well, I could be wrong. He may say no, it does, but it's mostly very organically shaped and
Mhm.
curved, and it would seem to be kind of breaking those rules. But because obviously we're not sitting down for every architectural project and going, okay, we've got to make sure that this
That's right.
all is a bunch of golden rectangles. It's just that we all know, and speaking as an interiors person, we all know when we walk in a space and it doesn't feel right.
Hmm.
Where the ceiling's too high and the walls are too close together, and we just go, this isn't a space that feels good. So it's sort of always innately there.
So, being that you're covering the interior design or a lot of the interior design aspects of the firm, is it something that you try to put into projects, or is it more of maybe a gut feeling because you're trained in interior design and whatnot? But it sounds like this is something that you could apply to the example of the room I'm sitting in to, in
Yeah.
theory, make it more kind of like feng shui or whatever. You know what I mean? Like you can apply principles of the golden
Yeah.
ratio to the artwork we're putting on the walls or where the chair rails at in
Right.
proportion to the ceiling or something.
Well, it's funny that you bring up feng shui, which comes from the Eastern, you know Asian cultures, which is that there is innate feeling and beauty in architecture and in your positioning. It's all about positioning. Now, I'm not a feng shui expert, but we all kind of like use that term. Oh, this is throwing off my feng shui.
Mhm.
Well, it's about where you're. Now we're getting sort of geospatial. Where am I on the earth, and which direction am I pointing, and what's happening behind me, and what's happening in front of me, and how does that make me feel? And this very simplest is, just we always hear this with our clients, is just having their back to the door. No, most people don't like to have their back to the door. They like to see what's coming. They don't want people to come up from behind them. Um, but there's also a lot of positioning, like beds and your head facing certain cardinal directions, and
Hmm.
how the energy flows, and again, that's another very level of spiritualness, the energy from the earth. And there are other things that we have over the last few years developed, like biophilia in design, the introduction of nature or natural elements in interiors, whether it be through color or plants or organics or patterns. But then you could argue it all ties back to that sequence again, right? That the
Mhm.
organics, the feeling, the curve, the so it's all sort of tied together.
And Kristi, not to interrupt you, but can you back up? What is biophilia? I've never heard that term before.
It's bringing in natural elements, or having things that are influenced by nature in actual built environment. So um, it can be as simple as introducing greenery and plants into a space,
Hmm.
or it can be more, you can delve a little deeper into back to the golden ratio, that feeling of things being in balance and being driven by natural things in the environment. It can be patterning on fabrics, and carpets, and the colors that are used in a space that might be influenced by biophilia. And there is this feeling that by bringing nature in, people feel calmer and more connected. If you can't work outdoors all day, then try to bring some of that
Hmm.
influence in. So I personally don't have the well building certification, but we have a person on our interiors team that does, where there are some of those principles that are part of of that study, in addition to building safety and
Sure.
other issues as well.
We did well. I was
Yeah.
at West Point. We did a was it middle school? West Point Middle School. We did some
Hmm.
interior design work with a couple other firms there, and they talked a lot about because a lot of the kids that go to that school are tend to be transient. They change locations a lot. They used animals and like local wildlife and local like vegetation
Hmm.
inside to help ground people. So the idea was very
Yeah.
much, I think, like this is where you are. This is what's going on
Hmm.
around this school. I think they
Understanding your
provided.
environment. There's been many studies on, using biophilic type design in healthcare, and the time reduction of people staying in the hospital, or shortens with certain, uses of that principle, whether it's through color or natural daylighting.
Mhm.
Um, like I said, the introduction of organics and plants or organic patterns um, have been used in that as well.
Well,
So
and as I understand it, you taught a full class, or was it just a portion of a class on
it
it?
was a portion of a
Okay.
class. So I taught a class called interior. What was it? It was like a methods
Okay.
course for
Mhm.
people just starting in their major for interiors, and in those courses you're introducing a lot of different principles. There's
Mhm.
other principles that we talk about in design, and that also overlay into architecture, art and architecture, and that's rhythm, balance, repetition, mirroring. There's a whole other group of things that we learn as well. That
Mhm.
there's certain things about repetition that are of interest in architecture. So yeah, rhythm, balance. I should know them all, but
How did so you're teaching students, right?
I was. Yeah, this is several years ago now
Okay.
that I was doing this. But
But like,
and in
how did
fact, one of
they?
my former students is now leads our interiors team, our interiors
Ah,
practice here at Woolpert. So,
that's good.
hmm
We learned a little bit about it in graphic design, just kind of
yeah,
the phenomenon of that this shows up in places.
hmm yeah,
But
because if you look at it in art, you can apply that spiral onto the Mona Lisa from her nose out
Mhm.
across. You can apply both the golden spiral and the golden rectangles to the Last Supper.
Hmm.
So there is definitely something about the balance, ancient art, ancient pottery that's kind of broken down into the one, two,
Mhm.
three module.
oh wow,
Um, there's also, and this comes from, you look back in biology, there's some inherent strength in that ratio too. So if you're
Hmm.
building a tower or you're building something tall and you're building it out of stone, there's something there about that balance. And I'm not a structural engineer, so maybe somebody could speak to that, but that allows things to be stable. So if you are I'm going to do this and I'm going to make this thing 3 times taller than the base, or it'll probably just fall over eventually. So there's something about that growth, like we talked about the growth pattern, that has inherent strength as well.
I wondered if, because you look at
Hmm
the Parthenon as an example, and obviously it's been standing for a very long time. I wondered if it was also something like a triangle, or flying
Yeah.
buttresses, things like that. That there's something about that particular.
Well, it's
Um,
that ratio 1.6. So if
okay.
you start to throw off your rectangle, you're building something that's that rectangular, but you're like,
Mhm.
I'm going to go taller and skinnier, then you could still build it. People might still like it, but it's not inherently as strong as it was back at that 1.6.
Okay. It's
Where
wild.
it's more stable and more balanced and more grounded. So,
It's funny, but you
yeah.
brought up, Kristi, the geospatial side, which was my
hmm
background, right? And so I immediately thought to myself, like, gosh, I wonder if anybody's ever taken, I imagine somebody has, but taken it and applied it to, large scale.
hmm
Because let's just say at the core, it's reproduction. And I'm flying over the US, and there's cropland, and there's mountains, and there's forests, and there's vegetation, and
mm.
there's, uh, you know, uh, drainage patterns. I wonder if it bears out at the micro scale and on
hmm
petals and sunflower seeds and pine cones in my hands. I would imagine, and again, as you said, I think galaxies, right? You look at the galaxies, and they have that spiral. So why not?
Hurricanes,
Yeah, why
low
would
pressure
not?
systems.
Why would not the
hmm
surface of the Earth maybe exhibit some of these similar ratios? I'm
So
gonna.
I came across, in preparation for this, I did come across a video that I watched last night that talked exactly about that, and
Hmm.
basically said, taking that aerial view
Uh huh.
of coastlines
Uh huh.
and river systems and
Mm-hmm.
how river systems feed into larger rivers, and then saying, you see all of this, and it looks just like the bronchial tubes of your lungs. It looks just like how trees grow underneath. So
It's almost a little
it
scary.
yeah,
You know what I mean?
yeah.
Like,
So
I don't know.
um,
It's all part of the algorithm. It's all based on
I
1.6.
all part of
guess.
the algorithm, or the good Lord's footprint or thumbprint, however you want to.
Well, Kristi, thanks for your time. It's been terribly interesting. Like I said, I don't have much of an appreciation for this, but now that it's from the very small level to the very big level, I'm going to look
Yep.
for it more often. We definitely
From
appreciate your time.
your DNA spiral
Okay.
to the galaxies of the universe
And everything in between.
and everything in between. It's
Wow.
there.
That's probably a good ender, huh? Ben, it's there.
Yep.
You won't be able to stop seeing it now.
It will be. If you look for it, you'll see it.
Cool. Well, thanks, Kristi.
Yep.
Take care. We'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you. This is fun.
Yep.